because of colonialism. Because from the point of view of Europe, the Far East was China and Japan and so on. The Middle East was in the middle between Europe and the Far East. And sometimes you'll hear the term Near East to describe the Middle East. Well, again, near to what? Near to Europe, as opposed to the Far East. So the whole concept of the Middle East is a colonial concept, but it's like a lot of other things in our language, it becomes so embedded in our thinking that even the people who live in the Middle East call it the Middle East in Arabic. The biggest Arabic language newspaper in the Middle East is called in Arabic the Middle East. So it's one of those ironies that, of course, what from Europe is called the Far East, if you live in California, it's the Far West. Right? So the Middle East is an artifact of colonialism, the whole concept of the Middle East. And just briefly, if we want to know how the Middle East came to be as it is today, you have to go back more than 100 years to the First World War. Now, again, this is pretty fuzzy ancient history to most Americans, and we don't talk much about the First World War for pretty good reasons, actually. We like to think that some wars are good and some wars are bad. My own view is that there's no such thing as a good war, but there may be wars that are justified or necessary. The First World War was none of those things. The First World War was competition between aggressive colonial states for power in Europe and power in the colonial abroad. And none of the states, they're shown, the green ones are the allies that we eventually joined later on in 1917. The purplish pinkish ones are the Central Powers, the opposition, so to speak, mainly Germany and Austria-Hungary, later joined by Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire. None of these countries was a democracy in any sense that we would understand it today. Great Britain, Germany, and Russia were all ruled by grandchildren of Queen Victoria. That is on both sides. Only France was a republic and had something close to universal male voting. Women couldn't vote in any of these countries, and of course in Russia nobody could vote. Russia, that was on our side, was the worst country of all the combatant nations in the war, and we eventually joined under Woodrow Wilson, President Woodrow Wilson, who was born on a slave-holding plantation in Virginia before the Civil War, and was notorious for promoting Jim Crow in Washington, D.C. He showed the racist film Birth of a Nation at the White House, and yet he claimed this was a war to make the world safe for democracy. Of course, that very much was not what had happened. So in the lead up to the war, again, the Ottoman Empire was somewhat beleaguered, was not one of the initial combatants, but on the theory of who is the biggest threat and who is your potential friend, they understood that the European powers, the democracies so-called, had been taking pieces of its territory for a generation or so, or more. The French took Algeria, the Italians took Libya, the British took Egypt and Sudan, the Russians were sort of pressing from the east, and Persia. So looking at that world, they determined that the most dangerous countries for them were the Allied nations, Britain and France and Italy, and they eventually joined the Central Powers in the war. And that was an opportunity for the British and French and other colonial powers because they figured they could finish off the Ottoman Empire and eat up its remains, which is of course what happened. And I should mention, in addition, the British had another reason. Here's the Ottoman Empire, sort of in darker green. The British had discovered oil in this area of Persia in 1906, and this was when the world was transferring its mobile navies and aircraft and automobiles into the use of petroleum as opposed to coal, and so that oil for the first time became a very strategic commodity. Britain is way over here, so unfortunately for them, and unfortunately for the Ottoman Empire, in between Britain's Persian oil and Britain, where they wanted it, was the Ottoman Empire, so it was a strategic target right from the beginning. So the war, of course, we think of the war as mainly in Europe, and of course the heaviest casualties in fighting were in Europe. But there was significant fighting around the fringes and of the Ottoman Empire as well. And some of you may remember seeing years ago the film Lawrence of Arabia, which is a kind of fictionalized version of that, but it reflects that actual history. And the fact is, in the early days of the war, Britain tried right away to grab as much Ottoman territory as it could and failed pretty miserably. They invaded Mesopotamia with an army that was made up mainly of Indian troops. India is over here. They tried to invade Palestine from the south, from their colonial holding in Egypt, and they tried to attack Constantinople, which is here, by attacking in Gallipoli, you know, in the Dardanelles Straits. And that also, you may or may not remember, but there was a modern, pretty good movie. Mel Gibson became a star based on that movie called Gallipoli, which was about the British attempt to approach Constantinople. And again, most of the troops involved in that were Australian and New Zealand troops, and that's why that was the thread of that story. That was the nature of the British Empire. Why bring Indian and Australian troops all the way around to Europe when they could fight closer to where they began in the Middle East? So Britain in 1914, 15, and 16 was not doing very well in its war against the Ottoman Empire, was looking around for allies. And they determined to try to break away the Arab. The Ottoman Empire was not Turkish, it was not Turkey, it was a multi-ethnic, multilingual empire like the Habsburg Empire in Austria-Hungary. It was not a modern sort of nation state. So it was a polyglot, especially in the Middle East. A lot of the people under Ottoman rule were Arabic speakers. Nationalism was just starting to, you know, penetrate into the Middle East. Nationalism in the sense that we know it was a European phenomenon primarily. And so the British made a deal with the Arab subjects of the Ottoman Empire that if they joined the British side against the Ottoman Empire, they would be independent following the war and would have an Arab state, an independent Arab state in this whole, including what's now the Arabian Peninsula, but also the Levant area, the Middle East and Iraq and so on. And they made the correspondence that promised that is still extant. But meanwhile, secretly, they were dealing with their allies, the French, the Russians, and the Italians, to divide up the same territory among themselves, the territory that they had promised as an Arab state. And this is the famous Sykes-Picot Agreement that probably some of you know about now. I mean, 20 years ago or 10 years ago, very few Americans have ever heard of this, but of course it's very well known in the Middle East. This is where a French bureaucrat and a British bureaucrat sat around a map and drew lines and divided up the Middle East, and of course it's what exists today. And I love to show this because the British are the classic empire builders, and they're so good at documenting everything. This is the original map that they drew up, which still exists in the British archives in May 1916, and you can see on the bottom the date and the two signatories, Francois Georges Picot and Mark Sykes. And so part of the Ottoman territory was, what you see in blue, was going to be French dominated, part of it in pink was going to be British, that is including what ultimately became Iraq and Jordan and Palestine. And at least initially, Palestine was going to be jointly ruled by all the Allied powers, in the sense that this was the Holy Land, and they all had some interest in the religious sites there and so on. So it would be jointly ruled, except the British were thinking ahead, except for Haifa, which is the best port in Palestine. The British negotiated to keep that for themselves. Why? Because they understood that following the war, that would be the easiest way to get the oil from Iraq to the Mediterranean and then to Great Britain. So they were thinking ahead even then. And so they had promised independence to the Arabs, including Palestine. They promised to share Palestine with the British, with the French and the Russians. And meanwhile, they also promised Palestine to the Zionist movement that was growing up in Europe at the time. And of course, they had no legal right to do that. It wasn't a treaty. The Zionist supporters were not a country, not a recognized political movement. But Balfour, in 67 words, expressed the intent of the British government to support the creation of what they call the Jewish national home in Palestine. And in theory, nothing should be done that would prejudice the existing population. They were not named in this document. And as a shock to the non-Zionists in Britain, that also this wouldn't have any effect on their status as British citizens. If they were a Jewish national home, they were free to choose that or not choose that or remain in Britain. We'll come back to the concept of Zionism itself. So, again, the U.S. entered the war in April 1917. After 2 years, the fighting had been going on. And the rhetoric was, make the world safe for democracy. And this was the sort of rhetoric that was used to convince the American people to join in, along with all kinds of lurid tales about atrocities committed from the other side, which is always part of war propaganda, right? The enemy is always vicious, savage, inhuman, and the reality, of course, is that all sides of war commit horrible atrocities, and that's always been true. But in theory, Wilson was saying, after the war, people should be free to choose their own government. Self-determination was a new concept. But meanwhile, the British and French, right at the end of the war, were meeting in the garden of the French embassy in London. And the two prime ministers, Georges Clemenceau and David Lloyd George, had a little stroll and had this conversation that was recorded. Remember, Palestine was originally supposed to be shared. So Clemenceau asked Lloyd George, what do you want? And he said, Mosul. So Mosul was this area, the northern part of what today is Iraq, which originally was supposed to be in the French zone. But there was oil recently discovered in Mosul, and the British wanted it. The French didn't have the means to exploit it, so they said, okay, you can have it, just give us a share of the oil, which is what was agreed. And then Clemenceau said, what else do you want? And Lloyd George said, Palestine. And Clemenceau said, okay. And that's the way it was decided. That's the way the whole history of 100 years and more after that was decided by a little stroll in the British embassy. Now, the U.S. was a little bit embarrassed with that. By the way, the U.S. never declared war on the Ottoman Empire. We were part of the war against Germany and Austria, but we were not part of that war, and we're not very much involved. Again, up until that point, the U.S. did not have very strong interests in the Middle East. There were religious missionaries and some educators that went there, but we didn't have the sort of imperial interest in colonizing the area as the British and French did. So some of those missionaries prevailed upon Wilson, and ultimately with the sort of grudging support of the other Allied powers, to do something novel, to send a commission to the Middle East to ask the people there what they wanted. In theory, the Treaty of Versailles said that, you know, every country, every former part of these empires that were being dismembered could choose how they wanted to be ruled. And they set up a commission. Henry Crane and Robert King. Crane was the president of Oberlin College. Crane was a plumbing magnate, whose company still exists. I haven't checked in your restroom, but there are a lot of plumbing fixtures, and you see a little bird, a little crane on it, and that's the Crane company that still exists. So they went to the Middle East and spent a month or 6 weeks traveling around, holding hearings and asking people what they wanted. And they reported back what they wanted. What people wanted was self-determination and independence. If they had to have a mandatory power, and I'll get to that this was a new concept, that countries that had been part of the Ottoman Empire and other empires who were considered not quite ready to be fully independent, they would have a sort of overlord to guide them to independence. These were called mandates. And so they said if they had to have a mandate power temporarily, they'd rather have the U.S. as it, because the U.S. was far away and not regarded as a colonial power from the point of view of the Middle East, even though, as I said, we were a colonial power, but just not locally in that neighborhood. And they were adamant of saying, in response to the Balfour Declaration, to oppose the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine. So they reported this back. It was buried. The report wasn't even published for years afterwards, and I doubt if any of you have heard of this King-Crane Commission. You can read it, you can find it online and read their findings, but it was effectively buried. and the US political establishment basically got behind the Balfour Declaration and the idea of a Jewish home, Jewish state in Palestine. And Balfour himself was very dismissive when his successor as foreign minister of Great Britain expressed some reservations about, was this a good idea? Because a Jewish state in Palestine, the Jewish population of Palestine then was between 5 and 7%. And the idea that this would become a Jewish state was, didn't look good. It wasn't a good look for British foreign policy. So George Curzon wrote to Balfour, and Balfour's response was, in Palestine, we do not propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of that country. So it was understood, that this was a colonial interest, and the natives be damned, which of course was the colonial interest in general. Now, you might ask, why was Balfour, why did the British get behind this idea of a Jewish state? There were various reasons. The one we know was not the main reason was love of the Jewish people. Balfour himself, like much of the British establishment and the American establishment at that time, was culturally anti-Semitic. But he had this idea, that anti-Semites often have, that the Jews were very powerful worldwide, and throwing them a bone would be something that would help the war effort, especially in the United States and maybe Russia, which had a large Jewish population. Also, since the British had the Suez Canal, Palestine was kind of the front yard of the Suez Canal. It was strategically important to them, and having a sort of subject country there, ruled by by proxy, was something that would help them strategically in terms of the Middle East. So they supported it. And just as a reminder, even though self-determination was the theory behind American involvement and making the world safe for democracy, following the First World War, not a single colonial possession of America or the European powers gained its independence. And of course that includes the countries in the Middle East, which were basically set up by the British and the French, and validated by the League of Nations. So it took a long struggle for many of the countries in the world that we're familiar with to become independent following the Second World War, 30 or more years later, and often with great bloodshed. Obviously Vietnam is one example, Algeria is another. Most of the countries in the Middle East did not become fully independent until the late 40s or the 1950s, or in some cases even later. So before we get to U.S. involvement today, I just want to remind you that we tend to think that U.S. policy in the Middle East has always revolved around Israel. But in fact, the oldest U.S. ally in the Middle East, and continues to this day, was Saudi Arabia, not Israel. In the teens and 20s, it was known that there was oil in Iran, Persia as it was called then, and Iraq, and there was an interest in exploring other areas close to there to see if there was oil. And the Saudis, being leery of the British, who were nearby in Iraq and India, and maybe had colonial ambitions, decided to invite the Americans to get the exploration concession in Saudi Arabia, and they made this giant oil discovery in 1938, the biggest oil gusher up to that point. And of course, Saudi Arabia and its neighboring countries have been one of the major producers of oil and gas ever since then. And this was so important to the United States, not because we needed their oil and gas, by the way. The United States was, and pretty much always has been, self-sufficient in oil and gas that we have in our own territory, but profiting from and controlling the oil in the Middle East was strategically really important to the United States, and remains so today, even though, again, we don't consume any significant amount of Middle East oil, but controlling the spigot for it is very valuable to the United States. So, that was symbolized by the fact that, Franklin Roosevelt, who was, very ill, close to death, attended the Yalta Conference that you all have seen that picture of him posing with Stalin and Churchill and so on. He was already visibly in bad health. It was so important that on the way home, he stopped to meet the King of Saudi Arabia on a U.S. ship in the Suez Canal to make this sort of alliance specific. That is, the Americans would control Saudi oil, and in return, we would regard Saudi Arabia as a kind of military protectorate of ours. And that started in the 1930s, and late and during the Second War, and has continued basically to this day, so that you can see a picture like this of every American president. And by the way, in terms of making the world safe for democracy, you know, the Middle East has a lot of really crappy countries that are not democratic at all. But in the running, Saudi Arabia is probably the chief contender for the worst country in the Middle East in terms of democracy and human rights. And yet it's been a close U.S. ally. You can see a picture like this of every U.S. president, Democrat or Republican, visiting Saudi Arabia, shaking hands, hugging, or in terms of Biden, fist bumping with the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia. So, you know, this was and remains the principal U.S. ally in the Middle East, and it goes back to a time before Israel even existed. And I just want to remind you, because this is a factor today, that during the Cold War, and control of the oil remained very important, in fighting Arab nationalism and the supposed threat of communism, religion was considered an important weapon in the hands of the U.S. and its allies. Remember, it was godless communism. So the U.S. took a strategic position then that they would support Islam as the counter to communism and nationalism. And they supported this in Saudi Arabia. And of course, the Saudis were very happy to go along because this earned their protection from the United States and also fulfilled their religious attitude. So Saudi Arabia spent a huge amount of money setting up missionaries and schools and mosques throughout the world, propagating the very, very radical fundamentalist idea of Islam that was based in Saudi Arabia. And you know, obviously we know that had some consequences. I just want to remind you, because people don't connect this, most of you are old enough to remember that in the 1950s, they added "Under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance when we used to stand there. I remember it was a change, right? Because at home, religion was something to use fighting godless communism as well. And it's also when "In God We Trust" was put on our money. This doesn't go back to George Washington. It goes back to Dwight Eisenhower. And again, this idea of promoting religion as the counterpart to communism. And of course, the logical consequence of that was supporting the fundamentalist Muslim rebels in Afghanistan, which Ronald Reagan called freedom fighters. These were the grandfathers of the Taliban that rule Afghanistan today. And as Brzezinski said, you know, they met in the White House. Brzezinski, who was Reagan's chief security advisor, pondered years later, what's the most important to the history of the world, the Taliban or the collapse of the Soviet Empire? Some stirred up Muslims or the liberation of Central Europe and the end of the Cold War? What could possibly go wrong, we would say now. And of course, one of our allies that we were funding and helping in Afghanistan was Osama bin Laden and his gang of Arab. Afghanistan was not an Arab state, it was a Muslim state, but Osama bin Laden was the leader of the sort of Arab military presence in Afghanistan. And of course, ultimately it led to the catastrophe for us of 9/11. And you remember George Bush saying they hate us for our freedom. Well, we don't have to wonder